expand our imagination.
Justification for being what you are.
And welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Marc Ambinder. Well, we're 12 days from Election Day, and it looks like Democrats may finally be finding their voice. We're seeing several Senate races tightening. A large number of House races remain competitive. And President Obama is in his element, drawing big crowds on a 4-day campaign swing out west. And we'll dig into the election a little bit later with Politic365.com Washington correspondent Charles Ellison and Politico's Jonathan Allen. But first, the New York Times' Peter Baker joins us. He had very recently several long conversations with the president about his past, his present, and his future. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start by listening to something the president said last night about Republicans.
You would have thought that given the crisis, when we got to Washington, Democrats and Republicans would come together. We'd put politics aside and deal with this once-in-a-generation challenge. I hoped, I expected that we could move beyond the game playing and the partisanship and the bickering that had dominated for Washington so long, roll up our sleeves and get to work. Because although we are proud to be Democrats, we are prouder to be Americans. And all of us have a stake in creating a better future. But the Republican leaders in Washington, they made a different decision.
Peter, the president told you that he expects to work better with Republicans after the midterm. What's he thinking? What's in his mind here?
Well, he's an optimist, I guess. He says that after the elections, either the Republicans will have won, in which case, in his view, they'll have some share of responsibility for governing and therefore perhaps want to work with him more closely, or they will have lost and perhaps be chastened by the failure of their strategy. Now, that's one way of looking at things, obviously. I think a lot of people in Washington would not probably view it that way and see the potential for quite a lot of confrontation in the next 2 years if Republicans were to take over one or both houses.
Do you think the president will be content over the next 2 years simply to sit and let Republicans perhaps self-destruct, or does he actively want to pursue an agenda?
I think he actively wants to pursue an agenda, but he recognizes it won't be the same agenda that he had the last 2 years. The last 2 years, fresh off of his election victory in 2008, he came in with a fairly transformative set of ideas: healthcare, financial re-regulation, education. Obviously, stimulus was a big package. And he was at his moment of maximum leverage, and even for that, he had a difficult time, obviously, getting many of these things through. He did get those 4 things through. The next 2 years, he recognizes he won't be able to do quite as much in that regard. It'll be more about implementation, more about making what he's already put through effectiveness and defending it against attacks in the Congress and in the courts.
What is his general explanation for the discontentment in the electorate? I mean, obviously there's the economy, but what does he think? Does he agree, or does he concede perhaps that his campaign promises, the tone of his campaign was too optimistic for the times, perhaps?
Right.
The expectations were too high?
I asked him about that. I read him a fairly famous quote from when he secured the nomination in 2008, and he talked about how this would be the moment people would look back and think that the oceans began to recede and the planet began to heal. And I said, well, how does that sound today, do you, sir, after all of what's happened? And he says, well, he doesn't back down from any of it. He says, he used the old Mario Cuomo line, you campaign in poetry and govern in prose, but he argued that he's actually made a lot of progress toward the goals he outlined in that sort of rhetorical flourish. But I do think the expectations obviously were enormous, and even outside of the crisis atmosphere that he took office in, would have been hard to match.
Finally, let me ask you, based on your conversation with the president and other advisors, in their gut, what do they think is going to happen on November 2nd, assuming, it's not going to be a good night for them, but how bad a night do they think it's going to be? Well,
I think that they feel that it's going to be a bad night, and I think that they're not going to admit it out loud, but they agree with most of the things that I think that have been written, you've written, other people have written about the House being pretty hard to see staying in Democratic hands. Senate, they feel obviously better. Individual Senate races have broken in a way that they think that they hang on to a very bare majority in the Senate. And it's just, it's either going to be a prescription for confrontation and gridlock, or something really interesting is going to happen in the next 2 years.
Peter Baker, thank you very much. And you can read Peter's interview with the president in the New York Times Magazine on NewYorkTimes.com. Turning now to our roundtable, Politic365.com's Charles Ellison and Politico's Jonathan Allen. Gentlemen, it certainly seems true that races are tightening for Democrats. Kentucky Senate race, Pennsylvania Senate race, certainly. What do you think's happening? We'll start with you, Charles.
Yeah, I mean, beyond that sort of the national trend of the enthusiasm gap that we've been seeing, particularly in some of those Gallup surveys, for example, when you see this enthusiasm gap, it's like 11, 14 points wide between Republicans and Democrats. Beyond that, when you start looking at the races locally, when you start looking at each individual district, you do see some tightening, even in some of those really competitive races that have been identified. I think there have been around 90 House races that have been identified as truly competitive. But you see some tightening in about from what I'm seeing, like 30, 40 of those races, you see like this suddenly that enthusiasm gap that you see nationally, you see that there may be some sort of mini surge of Democratic voters. And then again, you're also seeing this fundraising surge. I mean, in September, you had Democrats raising about $17 million. They actually had to revise the $16 million figure. And then in the first 13 days of October, they actually raised almost $12 million. So, and that's primarily from online donations and also direct mail contributions. So there's some sort of surge on the grassroots level that Democrats are seeing in terms of the fundraising and also in terms of these races. And then you can't count out the African-American vote. And that's going to be very crucial in states like Pennsylvania. I mean, you saw this sudden bump. It was like a 10-point surge with Joe Sestak. He's like 1 point ahead now of Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, places like Pennsylvania, Maryland. There's a tight gubernatorial race there, Illinois, and elsewhere. The black vote is going to be real crucial.
Jonathan Allen, is this because the president has decided to campaign and to go all out? Is that the primary reason we're seeing this enthusiasm gap among Democrats?
Well, certainly when the president goes around to various areas and campaigns, it lifts Democratic spirits, gets fundraising going, and gets people talking about going to the polls. So there's an energy behind that. But I think what you're really seeing with the tightening of the races, and we see this year after year, you get into that 2-week, 1-week zone, and the races all seem to tighten up. What you're seeing is people going back home to the party that they're normally with because they've been getting messaged by all these ads against candidates, for candidates, by outside interest groups. And what happens is they sort of naturally filter back into their party construct.
As if Democrats are remembering that they don't like Republicans, basically.
That's exactly right. The Republican candidate who's the new fresh guy against the old guy all of a sudden doesn't seem so good when you hear about his Social Security plan if you're a Democrat. But that said, what we're also seeing is you still have that in a lot of these races, you're talking about 45 to 44, 46 to 45, all within the margin of error and places where nobody's at that magic 50 mark. And so what you're going to see, what you usually see is independents will break in one direction in each of these races. In recent Senate elections, we've seen them all break in the same direction across the country for big Democratic sweeps in 06 and 08. I think the betting right now is that you'll probably see that go in the Republican direction. You've got a lot of Democratic incumbents who are under that sort of, even not just the 50 mark, but the 47, 48 mark, where it's really hard for an incumbent to win when they're polling at 47 or below, week after week, month after month. There are people who've done studies on this, and there's a certain mark where it's really hard for incumbents to win. So what I would look for is a lot of those to break Republican right at the end, but even though they're looking like they're tightening right now.
Charles, let me ask you this. There seems to be in the election a large number of voters, even in an election where the choices could not be more stark, who are sitting and waiting to make a decision until the last minute. What do you think that's about? What are they waiting for? What are they trying to see that they haven't seen already?
I mean, one, they're also trying to see from at least the White House first. I mean, because jobs and the economy is number one. So from the White House first, they want to see some sort of empathy from the president. They want to see the president kind of feeling their pain, so to speak. We go back to basically shades of Bill Clinton. 96, but they want to see the president kind of feel their pain on the ground. That's why I find it really interesting as he's making this sort of this 4-day swing through these western states. These are in cities and towns and states where he's essentially getting a very friendly audience. And really, some folks, particularly who are in tight races like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, for example, he's saying, you need to come to places like West Virginia. You need to talk to those white working class voters, those folks who are dealing with high unemployment numbers, who are dealing with a record number of foreclosures, and you need to kind of get a sense of what they're going through. And I think that that's what people want to. I think that that's what Democratic voters want to see. I think especially that's what independent voters want to see as well, because in some races you see a high number of undecideds, and I think that they're waiting for the president. They're also waiting for a lot of Democratic candidates to say, hey, we understand this, that you have problems as far as unemployment. We understand you have problems as far as foreclosure. We understand that you're going through a lot of pain. And I think that they want to see more of that in these last 2 weeks.
But the president is, particularly among white working class voters, very unpopular in West Virginia. And one would assume that Joe Manchin, the Senate candidate for Democrats, would have asked the president. My sense is he'd much rather have Joe Biden come to West Virginia than the president. But you're saying the president should ignore conventional wisdom in that sense.
I think he should. I think that he should do something really dramatic, something that's just very unorthodox and unconventional, and particularly in these last 2 weeks. I mean, what does he have to lose at this point? If you really think about it, what do you have to lose? I mean, just go ahead and go there. I mean, the optics of that, of him sort of, I understand that there's a little bit of risk in that, but when you have people like Joe Manchin, you even have, one of his more popular surrogates from 2008, Claire McCaskill in Missouri. Missouri also dealing with some tight races down there. She's even saying the same thing. You know what? You need one of those moments like before he had this moment where he was at a town hall forum and there was a black woman who had voted for him in 2008 who said, you know what, it's getting to be a little bit tiresome trying to defend you. And, she said that in a sort of, somewhat supportive way to him, but she wanted to let him know, hey, don't forget us folks on the ground. And I think, too, this is just, I'm kind of bucking conventional wisdom on this one too, but I think Democrats, including the president and a lot of Democratic strategists, I think they have to kind of tone down the talk a little bit about, Tea Party voters or independents or some of these white working class voters being a little bit, less in tune with public policy, or being, some people say, that they're a little bit stupid,
shouldn't play down or talk down to them.
They shouldn't talk. Yeah, I think that there is a little bit of that tone, or that they're racist or something like that. I think that, maybe try to be a little bit conciliatory in the tone. You might be surprised. Maybe you might get one or two Tea Party voters. Well, not at least Tea Party voters, but you might get one or two white working class voters who might say, you know what, this guy gets it. I'm going to vote for a Democrat this season.
Well, perhaps it'll be wisdom before it's conventional. Jonathan Allen, let me go back to you. You have written about the possibility that several Democratic House committee chairs will lose their races, like Skelton, the Armed Services Committee chair, Barney Frank, the House Financial Services, or the House Financial Services Committee chair. What effect is that having on the mood of the caucus at this point?
Well, I think it's alarming to a lot of Democrats to see folks who have hung on for a long time. Even John Dingell in Michigan has a race on his hands. I think most people expect him to win, but he's been in office since 1955. He's survived a lot of wave elections one way or the other, and all of a sudden these guys are raising money like there's no tomorrow, spending money. Barney Frank gave himself $200,000 the other day out of his own personal funds.
Yeah, not something you do if you're in a safe race.
Yeah, no, not at all. His own money. I mean, it's basically a large percentage of what he's actually worth. So I think what it does is it creates a little bit of an extra panic among Democrats when they're looking around going, well, if that guy's in trouble, if Barney Frank is in trouble in a district in Massachusetts that's got some of the nicest, wealthiest Democratic suburbs of Boston, everybody's in trouble. And of course, I think a lot of people don't understand that Barney Frank actually has a lot of those working class voters that have been drifting away from the president and his party for the last 2 years. He's got a lot of Portuguese community in Fall River and a lot of other working class towns around that as well. But you're seeing it. You mentioned Ike Skelton, Barney Frank. Jim Oberstar in northern Minnesota got one contribution of $200 or more in like a 2.5 month period from his own district. And he's all of a sudden got a race on his hand. John Spratt in South Carolina, the Budget Committee chairman. Nick Rahal in West Virginia, the Natural Resources chairman. The list goes on and on. I mean, there's about half a dozen of these guys who have been in Congress since the 1970s, or in Dingell's case, since the 1950s, who all of a sudden are running scared. And I think several of them will win. Probably at least a couple of them will lose, and they will go down as trophies for Republicans, whether they win the House or not.
Jonathan Allen of Politico, Politic 365. Washington correspondent Charles Ellison, thank you so much for joining us. And that is it for Washington Unplugged today. Join us here every day on CBSNews.com. You can also catch me on TheAtlantic.com. I'm Marc Ambinder. Have a great day.